Welcome, I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. Today we'll talk about Venus's journey through August and September. There is a narrative here, and that's why I combined both months, because it really requires seeing 2 months back to back to really see how Venus changes and what's going on with her. And I'll also help weave this into current events and give you some ideas for how you can interpret her journey in your own chart. Well, I wanted to say thank you first and foremost to all of my patrons. If you would like to become a patron and get early access to videos and exclusive access to other videos about astrology and magic, or to join our monthly magical astrology Q&A, or to get access to the monthly magical elections document, just head on over to patreon.com/Nina Griffin and you can see the different tiers and the different benefits and all that stuff. Let's get started. All right, so Venus in Cancer. So right now I'm recording this, it's August 16th, and Venus entered Cancer August 7th of this year. This is Pacific time. Now, this is an interesting placement because this is really the placement where we get a lot of intense emotion out of Venus. She is very often artistic and just feels things very strongly. You know, there's a lot of metaphorical and literal shedding of tears with this particular placement. In addition, because Cancer is ruled by the moon, which is the planet of motherhood and one's parentage and nurturing, I've noticed that for a lot of people with Venus in Cancer, the importance of parenting and parentage, in other words, one's origins, becomes very important. All of this, of course, has strong lunar connotations. Now, this video I think you'll find especially useful if Venus rules your ascendant, so you have either Taurus or Libra rising, or if Venus is your ruler of the year at this time. And I'm talking about ruler of the year in methods such as profections, which is just an annual way of changing which house and which sign rules you for a particular year. You can look that up separately. There are a lot of good videos on this medieval technique nowadays. I was going to talk about Venus in Cancer illustratively with Kamala Harris, who is a US Senator from California and most recently has become a VP candidate. I'll explain in a minute why Kamala Harris is a really good stand-in for Venus for the next few months anyway. So Kamala Harris does not, as far as we know, have Taurus or Libra rising, nor is she in a Venus-ruled year. However, because she's a public person, and this is just the technique that I have observed that you might find helpful if you ever look at the astrology of current events, is that for a period of time, if a public person does something that strongly links them to a particular planet, they become that planet for some period of time. Not necessarily forever or even for years, but maybe for some months or weeks, depending on what's going on with that planet's activities. I'll give you an example using Kamala Harris. So Kamala Harris, after many months of speculation over who was going to be the VP candidate for the Democrats this year in the 2020 election, it's interesting, she was announced as the VP candidate on a very important date, I would say in between two very key dates. So she was announced August 11th as the VP candidate. And what's interesting is that Venus in the sky she reached maximum brilliance August 7th. Now this itself is interesting. Now Venus, when she reaches maximum brilliance, is incredibly bright in the sky. And if you do any kind of sky watching or star watching, you really don't need a telescope to see Venus at this time. Not that you usually do, but especially not. And she is so bright that even though I knew where Venus was supposed to be, and I was looking at Venus in the sky, I knew what I was looking at, and I still had to double check myself to make sure I wasn't actually looking at an airplane. She was just that strong and that bright. I read somewhere that it is during these periods of Venus's greatest brilliancy that she's often reported to be a UFO, because she looks kind of 3D and very bright. It's just a really nice appearance of Venus. Now, her maximum brilliancy was August 7th, but, you know, this definitely applies several days before and several days after. So it's something that really it's more of a period that she goes through rather than a single day event. So I thought it was quite interesting that the first sort of I would say, well, we've had female VP candidates before, but the first kind of very serious VP candidate where people thought, yes, there's a real chance here of winning. This is a campaign that has strong potential to win. This is the year that we got a female and a woman of color as a VP candidate. That's a first. And that's this Venus brilliancy, right? So immediately you think, okay, so maybe Kamala Harris, Venus is going to represent her story, at least in the next few weeks or months. Now, the other thing astrologically that happened, or astronomically, was that on August 13th, which is also interesting, just 2 days after Kamala Harris was announced, Venus reached her maximum elongation. And maximum elongation simply means that Venus is as far as she can get from the sun. You might know that Venus can never be more than about 2 signs away from the sun, like 64 or so degrees. And whenever Venus reaches her maximum elongation, it just means that in this particular cycle, she's as far away from the sun as she can be. And as you can imagine, this is a very special position for Venus to be in. In this particular case, Venus is oriental of the sun, meaning she appears and rises before the sun. So astronomically, what you get is you might get Venus rising in the eastern sky at, let's say, 3 a.m. or something, and then the sun follows her a couple of hours later, or 3 or 4 hours later, depending on your location. In other words, she rises before the sun. Symbolically, this is a really interesting place for any planet to be, particularly Venus. And this is because whenever a planet rises before the sun, I always think of it as, here is the planet that rises or marches before the king. It's a position of tremendous authority, responsibility, and above all, visibility. So once again, in addition to Venus reaching her greatest brilliancy, we also have her reaching her greatest power and honor. Most people never get to march before the king, but in this case, she does. And if you think about it, that seems to be very appropriate for how she was announced. She was very much announced as sort of a co-equal running mate to Joe Biden. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen it quite so both hyped, but also given that much importance who the VP is going to be. So I think it is a very appropriate symbolism for Kamala Harris to be announced just between these two little astronomical events, between August 7th and between August 13th, right in the middle, August 11th. So I think that we can safely think about Kamala Harris as Venus, which I think tells us a little bit about how the campaign will be conducted and how she's going to do. I'm not going to talk about the rest of this fall until Election Day, although I think that would be a very interesting discussion, and I'd like to do a separate video on this if time permits. But particularly, I wanted to just kind of give you an idea of what this means for August and for September, and also we can just kind of keep track and see whether this narrative really matches what's actually happening with her and with her in the campaign. So this is just my general recommendation as a technique. Always take notice of these important planetary events, like a planet becoming elongated from the sun or a planet achieving maximum brilliancy, to get a sense of which public person is linked to that planet for the time being. And you can certainly do this, as I said, personally for yourself if you have some special relationship to Venus. If she rules your ascendant, if she's your Lord of the Year. The reason that Kamala Harris doesn't have to have this as her ascendant or ruler of the year to be kind of quasi-Venus ruled for a few months, let's say, is because whenever you enter the public narrative, which major politicians do, even minor ones, you get to borrow the planets. You get to take on their mantle without even necessarily it being connected to you astrologically in a very strong way. It's kind of like the planets are telling a story and the actors change. There are only 7 visible planets. The actors might change, so you always have sort of different actors playing the same role, if you will. But at the same time, you get the same idea of you get the idea of, let's say, Venus doing something, and for that time being, while Venus, as if it were, possesses that person will act in concert with Venus's movements. Hopefully that made sense. But I think you get what I'm saying, right? You get to own Venus, or maybe Venus owns you for a short period of time. And it's a bit of an honor, right? It's kind of like, I think of those voodoo rituals where the different gods or lois possess the people doing the rituals. And so the people start acting like the different lois, like the different gods, for the duration of the ritual. Now, going back to more mundane concerns, Venus opposes Jupiter, Pluto, and then squares Mars, and this is about a 10-day period, August 25th through September 4th. So you get about that 10-day experience of intense conflict and pressure. And again, you might experience this personally if you are tied into Venus, but at the same time, you might also see it in public. And the people that are going to be experiencing that conflict and pressure during this period, you can say, okay, perhaps they are taking on Venus for the time being, or Venus is taking them on for now. And I think with Kamala Harris, I wouldn't be surprised if she had a 10-day period of some difficulty or some pressure, or coming into conflict with some established power structures, all of those wonderful keywords that the planets that are currently in Capricorn, which are of course Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, represent. What's interesting to me is that immediately after she does this, she transits into Leo. So she has this period of conflict, and then she goes into Leo. And Leo is, historically, it was known as both a royal sign, because of course it's the sign of the lion. It's also a victorious sign, because it is royal, right? Like it's the king of beasts, because he's the greatest. And so this is the same idea, right? So Venus goes from this very intense, emotive, very powerful sort of constellation of emotions as she passes through Cancer. She gets involved in some kind of conflict or something like that, and then immediately enters the sign of victory, Leo. So I think what that tells us is that she probably emerges from this conflict, if not victorious, then at least unharmed. And I think it also tells us that we're dealing here with a very powerful player whom we may underestimate at our own peril. This is somebody who can, I think, put the fear of God in other people. Not everybody has that talent, but apparently, maybe while Venus possesses you this fall, you get to do that. So I would suggest that, at least for now, Venus seems to be going from strength to strength. And again, you may be Venus if she rules you. And we're also talking about potentially Kamala Harris for now. What's interesting is that in contrast to all those intense aspects that Venus experienced as she passed through Cancer, her journey through Leo is relatively uneventful. You know, she squares Uranus, okay, and then trines Mars, which seems positive. So this just seems like such a brilliant and powerful position for Venus to be in. I'm very curious to know how this impacts both Kamala Harris and also you personally, if Venus happens to be your Lord of the Year or ruler of the Ascendant. I'd be happy to know. Feel free to put it in the comments. I think it is going to be an interesting moment, if you will, around that September 26th date. Now, a few days before that, September 22nd, the Sun enters Libra. And this to me is extremely an interesting counterpoint. As you know, when the Sun enters Libra, he enters his fall. So it's not really a good place for the Sun to be, in the sense of, you know, if you're going to have the king falls, right? I don't know if that happens literally this year. I'm not counting on it. But it is interesting that while Venus is in the royal sign, the Sun goes into a Venus sign and falls. So you have this really interesting kind of thing. It's like they meet each other on the staircase, and one is on the way up and the other is on the way down. You know, that kind of experience. What happens then is that they're going to be in each other's signs for some time. Venus will be in Leo, the Sun's sign, and the Sun will be in Libra, Venus's sign. Now, modern astrologers call that mutual reception, but historically, traditionally, that's not entirely sufficient for mutual reception. To have true mutual reception, you need an aspect between the two planets. And at least in late September, the Sun and Venus are going to be too far apart to be in a sextile. However, there is a name for this relationship traditionally, and it's called generosity. All that means is you have two planets in each other's signs of domicile or exaltation, and that's it's generosity, right? They are mutually indebted to each other. It's not always, I would say, a friendly relationship. If there was a sextile aspect, I think I would be more comfortable saying there's a comfortable relationship there. But if they're in each other's signs, there's a certain interdependence, if you will, and again, generosity and a sense of owing the other person something. So I don't know exactly what this means. I'm kind of guessing, but it's generally positive for both of them. Now, I would argue that Venus comes out better here because she is in Leo, whereas the Sun is in his fall. So the Sun is not really in an advantageous position. But there is a clear sense here that they kind of depend on each other. They're kind of like, I don't know, partners in a ping pong match or something like that, where there is a sense of needing each other or using each other in some way. So I'm very curious to know how that impacts the campaign. You know, the Sun could be Joe Biden. It could also be Donald Trump, right? Really any person, particularly a man, in a position of authority. So I'm very curious. On a personal level, you know, if you are Venus and there's somebody else who is the Sun, keep an eye out at the last week of September or so. Who is going to be that person in your life? I think you'll find some really interesting correlations at that point. So again, I don't think that this means like a sudden fall of the king, right? The Sun goes to Libra once a year, every year, no change there. But given what Venus represents, I do think it'll be quite important. All right, so that's all I have on Venus in Cancer and Leo. Obviously, Venus will continue going through other signs. So in October, she's going to be in Virgo for a little bit over 3 weeks, a very quick trip through the sign of her fall. And then at the end of October, she enters Libra, her own sign. And so what's interesting is that if you're looking at this as a mundane political kind of discussion, Venus is going to be in her own sign on election day. So that to me seems quite auspicious. But it's also, Venus is going to be at her most wonderful and brilliant because Kamala Harris is probably going to be working very hard to be putting in public appearances and just doing everything she can to increase visibility in the crucial few days before the election occurs. I'm sure we'll talk more about that as that time approaches. Meanwhile, thank you for watching. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel.